Imagine if you could possibly combine a rider like Peter Sagan with a rider like Julian Alaphilippe. You'd arguably create the ultimate bike racer, someone who could win in the mountains, win a bunch sprint, be in contention for the GC overall in a Grand Tour, and probably mop up a few one-day classics along the way too. Obviously it's not very ethical to do that with bike racers, but in a roundabout way it's what Specialized has done with its latest bike. So two have merged into one as we wave goodbye to the Venge and say hello to the Tarmac SL7. So there are just a handful of bikes throughout racing history that you could genuinely classify as iconic. And I think few would argue that the Specialized Tarmac is one of them, purely because it's set so many benchmarks along the way, and also just for the sheer number of races that it's won. We have to go all the way back to 2002 to when it first came into the big time, when Mario, the Lion King Cipollini, won both the Milan-San Remo and the World Road Race Championships on board what was then called the Tarmac E5, a kind of aluminium and carbon mix. But it was the start of a journey that has led the Tarmac to help riders like Paolo Bettini, Tom Boonen, Mark Cavendish, Alberto Contador, Vincenzo Nibali, and as we've already mentioned, Peter Sagan and Julian Alaphilippe, to some really amazing victories on the world stage. 2011 was a crucial year for Specialized, a juncture which saw it collaborate with McLaren F1 and develop its first Venge. That gave its pro riders two bikes at their disposal. The Venge, obviously the super aero bike for those faster, flatter stages, and the Tarmac for the mountains. That was exaggerated even further in 2015 when Specialized developed the Venge Vias, an even faster version which it claimed at the time was a full 2 minutes quicker than the Tarmac over 40 kilometres. By 2018 though, the gap between those two key models had definitely started to narrow. Whilst the Venge had got faster, it was also significantly lighter and also more comfortable, and was starting to become a bit more of an all-round performer. Meanwhile, the Tarmac SL6, a bike which had no problem at all hitting that UCI minimum weight limit of 6.8 kilos, was definitely more aerodynamic. So it seems almost natural progression then that we've ended up here with this, the Tarmac SL7. The convergence of those two bikes and all the learning that Specialized gained from the Venge and the Tarmac into one bike. What that means for Specialized pro riders is no longer having to make a choice for which bike to ride come race day. And that's because Specialized says this S-Works Fact 12R frame set weighs just 800 grams, which means it'll have no problem hitting that UCI minimum weight limit. But crucially for the racers though, is it says it's 45 seconds faster than the SL6 over 40 kilometres. So let's take a closer look through the bike and run through some of those features that Specialized says has helped it to achieve what it set out to do. This is the flagship model, so Tarmac SL7 S-Works Di2. So this one's going to have all the bells and whistles. So when it comes to aerodynamics, the front end of the bike is obviously crucial, as it's the first part that hits the oncoming air. Specialized has redeveloped its Aerofly bar system, so this is Aerofly 2 now, and although it doesn't look hugely different to the first generation, if I'm honest, Specialized does say it has worked hard on the integration of the cables and to keep that as slick and seamless as possible. And actually, one thing that is really nice while we're talking simplicity here is that this is a two-piece system, not a one-piece bar and stem. So it's essentially the same as a standard traditional handlebar and stem, just with a neat way of integrating all that cabling. In fact, if I just flick that top cap off there, you can actually see underneath there is, yeah, essentially just a standard bar stem setup, but with all the aerodynamic gains, obviously. Elsewhere for aerodynamics up front then, we've got new tube profiles for the head tube and the fork blades, and new frame shapes as well that Specialized says has been the result of countless iterations through CFD and also wind tunnel testing to really refine those shapes down and find that balance point that it's been after for the SL7 to get the performance in terms of aerodynamic speed of the Venge, but with the stiffness and ride quality that the Tarmac was known for. What immediately jumped out to me was the fact that the tube seemed to be a lot narrower than what I'm used to seeing from Specialized. And certainly one thing I noticed straight away was going back to a threaded 68mm bottom bracket shell, which is, yeah, I'm certainly not going to be one to complain about the end of the press fit bottom bracket, that's for sure, and all the little foibles and nasties that created. So I challenged the product manager, Cameron Piper, about that after the launch of this bike, just to find out a bit more about the thinking with that, because I was quite surprised to see the narrower tube profiles on this bike, especially with regards to the water bottles and aerodynamics, because a lot of brands have been going wider and wider in the down tubes to try and combat that airflow around the bottles. But he assured me that all of the testing that Specialized does in the wind tunnel is done with 2 bottles in place, so it's real world and practical in that regard. And also, while we're talking real world and practical, this is FACT 12R carbon, so Specialized top of the range carbon for the creation of this S-Works frame. And it uses what it calls rider first engineering. So that basically means, in a nutshell, whether you're 5 foot tall or 6.5 foot tall, whichever frame size you buy, you can be sure the ride qualities will be the same across the board. Elsewhere on here, we've got a new wheel set. This is the Roval Rapide CLX. The bike is disc only. That's something else I should point out. So no more rim brake models available in Tarmac SL7. It is disc only. 60mm rim depth in the rear, 35mm external width, and a 21mm internal width. Up front, we've got a 51mm rim depth and the same 35mm external width. Really quite wide there, really visible, especially with this bike coming with 26mm tyres fitted. You can see the amount of clearance around that 26mm tyre, and that's a real trend now within the industry as a whole. And again, like many of its competitors, Specialized will say this bike will have clearance for 32mm tyres comfortably. One thing that is quite interesting with tyres, though, is the lack of tubeless, especially given that Specialized has its own range of tubeless tyres already. But again, when I challenged Cameron Piper about that, he simply just said that, you know, with the profiles they were working towards for the aerodynamics that they wanted for this wheel set, they just simply couldn't make that tubeless rim bed work. So yeah, that's interesting. Maybe that's one that we'll see in future. Nice to see that Specialized has integrated its power meters into the Dura-Race crank. I think that group set is, you know, undeniably going to be one of the best cranks as well on the market. So to integrate that, that's a collaboration they've done with 4i for the power meters. And really, I guess much of the story of this bike is going to be the enviable position that Specialized is in, owning its own wind tunnel and being able to develop so many of those components itself. Other than the drivetrain, really, there's nothing that Specialized isn't making itself in-house here, and therefore gives it the ability to test this as a complete system. Gone are those days of just making a frame and testing that on its own in the wind tunnel and then fitting aftermarket parts to create your bike. You know, we're well past that, and actually Specialized isn't alone in that regard. You know, lots of the top-end manufacturers are taking that stance now. A nice little bit of integration as a detail here is this little junction box that Specialized has created in the head of the seat post here. Rather than using the Shimano bar end junction box, which is now commonplace in many of the top end bikes, it just sort of frees up a few less cables to be coming through the handlebar and stem. And as the battery's in the seat post anyway, it kind of makes sense. So that's all pretty neat and tidy too. So I guess the bit a lot of you are keen to know is how much does it weigh and how fast actually is it? So 800 grams is the frame weight Specialized claims for the S-Works level frame, and that, built in this Dura-Race guise, comes in at 6.7 kilos straight out of the box, which gives you a little bit of weight spare for pedals and things to be bang on that UCI weight limit of 6.8 kilos. In terms of aerodynamic performance, Specialized says this is 45 seconds quicker than the outgoing Tarmac SL6 over 40 kilometers. Now, where does that put it in terms of the Venge? Overall, ever so slightly, the Venge is still aerodynamically a faster bike. But the key thing to remember here is that Specialized is looking at the sort of the complete package with the SL7. So yes, it might be fractionally slower. I think Cameron Piper said 2.5 watts difference compared to the Venge in terms of aerodynamic savings, but overall you've maintained that stiffness and performance. But crucially, for a sort of all-round performance sort of GC level race bike, is the handling, and that's something that the Tarmac has always kind of been renowned for, is just that beautiful race-ready handling that you'd expect of the bike, which, you know, going to aero in the past has definitely impacted, you know, with the likes of the Venge and other top-end aero bikes. You do have to sacrifice some of those handling traits, but That's basically the crux of this bike. The compromises are gone. So for first impressions, well, I think I've ridden pretty much every iteration of the Venge and the Tarmac over the years, and I can really get that sense of the unification of those two key models in this bike. It's got a pleasing sense of familiarity about it, actually. A bit like going to your mum and dad's for Sunday dinner, only the meal that you're delivered has been created by a team of Michelin-starred chefs. Sorry mum, nothing against your cooking obviously, but what I mean is, you know, it's immediately apparent that what Specialized has dished up here is a really polished and distinguished product. The frame stiffness is immediately apparent, both in the power delivery and also its agility, something that the SL6 was highly praised for. And from my own perspective, I found the SL6 was a really agreeable bike to ride, just easy to ride and get on with. And thankfully, that seems to have been maintained in this, the SL7. Aerodynamically, I don't have the technology to corroborate Specialized claims, but what I do have is many years of test data and ride data from my familiar training routes. And having put this bike to the test around those routes recently, I've already posted some pretty quick times, which bodes well, but obviously I'll be testing this bike much more thoroughly, and look out for a full review on cyclist.co.uk in due course. But certainly I'd want to test with some wider tyres. I do feel like these 26mm tyres sit well within the confines of those wide new profile rims. I've got to be honest, I'm a little bit disappointed not to see tubeless as an option. I'm a real fan of the tubeless tyre technology and what that brings to the ride feel, but certainly I'd want to test this bike with maybe a 28mm tyre. The profile wouldn't really disrupt the aerodynamics much, if at all. So yeah, that'll be key, and it certainly would afford the bike just a little bit more comfort. While I'm on the subject of comfort, it's interesting that Specialized didn't choose to use the technology it has from its Roubaix bike in the seat post. So clamping the seat post lower down the seat tube to give more of the post length over to flex and offer the rider a bit more vertical compliance. Now, that's not to say that this is a jarring ride, it's actually not. And compared to the original Venge or even the Venge Vios, which were both quite harsh bikes to ride, you know, this bike is not like that at all. Much more agreeable, but let's not forget, it's actually faster aerodynamically than both of those bikes, which I think really kind of shows the developmental leap that Specialized has made in the production of this frame. I can't round out my first impressions without talking about the colour. I do really like the colour of this particular model. It might look matte black from some angles, but it's got this kind of almost liquid green top coat which shimmers in the sunlight and reminds me a little bit of the Green Goblin from the Spider-Man movies. But hey, you know, if that's not your bag, then there is a more corporate red version of this in the Dura-Race Di2 spec. So there it is, that is the Tarmac SL7, or as I now like to call it, the Vermac. Right here obviously is the flagship S-Works Di2 model, and that's going to cost you just a pound shy of 10.5 grand, so quite a pricey beast. Although the SL7 range does start at £4,500 with the Expert Ultegra Di2 model. That does use the slightly lower spec FACT 10R carbon frame, but that's actually only 120 grams heavier. And Specialized says, other than weight, it retains all the other attributes of the top-end model. For me, a standout model in the range is the Tarmac Pro, that Specialized has chosen to spec with a 1x-road group set using SRAM's Force ETAP axis components. But all the pricing and information on the various models will be in the link below. For me, it's no small deal that Specialized has decided to go down this route of bidding farewell to its Venge. However, if you do still want to own one, it is going to be available as a frame set only option going forwards. Crucially though, the Tarmac SL6 will still remain in the range, although that's been pushed down to the lower comp and sport pricing tiers, but that does mean you could potentially be owning a bike with Grand Tour winning pedigree from as little as £2,500. Now, all this sort of thinking about merging bikes does get the imagination rolling, and I do think it's not actually beyond the realms of my imagination to think that in the future we could be looking at a third of Specialized key models, the Roubaix, also bringing some of its traits into the melting pot. Would it be crazy to think that Specialized could maybe make a few tweaks to this frame, save a bit of weight here and there, and free up some space up front to pop in that future shock? Who knows? We'll have to watch this space. But in the meantime, it does look like we're getting ever closer to that goal of having everything we could possibly want from one single bike. All of the Tarmac SL7 models will be available to buy by the time you see this. And as I said, don't forget to look out for my full in-depth review on cyclist.co.uk coming soon. Also, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to our channel by clicking the button below.